Good evening. I am Dr. Rubén Mendoza of the Archaeology Program of the California State University at Monterey Bay. I've been invited to talk to you about Mission San Jose and its association with a form of solar geometry that's specific to the equinox or equinoctial illuminations of the main altar tabernacle. This is a phenomenon that after some study spanning back to approximately 1997, I came to realize that many of the early California missions were in one way or another linked to a form of solar geometry, which was an attempt to illuminate the various religious objects within the churches of the California missions. Since that time in 1997, I've not only documented what was happening at Mission San Juan Bautista, where this first came to my attention, but I've been able to determine that the missions have a connection to various types of illuminations, all of which have both astronomical and liturgical dimensions. These include a midsummer solstice illumination at Mission San Carlos Borromeo, or Carmel, as well as a winter solstice or midwinter solstice illumination at Mission San Juan Bautista here in California. Since that particular point in time, and as of 2004, I was able to determine that approximately 18 California missions were in one way or another linked to a solar geometry that includes a host of different sites and varying phenomena. The purpose of this? Well, over the course of these many years of documenting these solar illuminations of main altar tabernacles, as well as bultos or statues of the saints, I've come to the realization that much of this is linked to the cosmology of the Franciscan order, or brother, sun, and sister moon. And in so doing, I've been able to track this across the entirety of the American Southwest to the missions of San Antonio, Texas, as well as into northern Mexico, the Sonoran missions, Mexico City, Chiapas, and a host of other regions. Since that time, other colleagues have brought to my attention these illuminations having a link or bearing as far afield as South America. And while I was in Peru approximately 2 years ago, I was able to identify a host of churches that therein include a very similar pattern of solar geometry, except it's flipped in that our summer is their winter and our winter is their summer. Even so, the illuminations continue to bear light, if you will, that relates very directly to the fact that the liturgy is being elevated and illuminated by the solar geometry of these individual churches. So having said that, what then does it all mean? Well, in the course of doing my studies, I have found a host of ancient volumes like this one, which essentially document in one form or another I guess for lack of a better term, a lunar calendar, otherwise known as el calendario metónico, or the ecclesiastical calendar. Volumes or works that were published and printed and written up in the 18th century, in Spain no less, were sent to the Americas so as to assist the friars, especially the Fernandinos or the Franciscans of the Order of Friars Minor, with being able to calibrate the liturgy, specifically related to the movable feast of the Catholic tradition. And we're talking primarily of those that relate specifically to Easter. When you think of Easter, you have to think of the movable feast of the sacred calendar. The reason it's a movable feast is that we have to bear in mind at the time of Christ's birth and ultimately his crucifixion, through the entirety of his life, the Metonic calendar was used by the Jews in order to calibrate their own important feast observances. As a result, what we get is the fact that the Catholic Church, for centuries, has used the Metonic or lunar calendar in order to calibrate or recalibrate the placement of Holy Week and all of those days anticipating the Holy Week. When we consider the Metonic calendar, we have to bear in mind that it's not unique to the Catholic tradition. In fact, it goes all the way back to ancient Persia. And of course, it in turn was eventually transmitted into the greater Southwest Asian region, including those regions identified with the nascent Jewish peoples. and it was they who continued to use that calendar in order to document the passage of time. Of course, at the time of the crucifixion of Christ, it was as a result of the use of their calendar, the Metonic calendar, that we are able to calibrate specifically to the period that is identified with the crucifixion of the Christ and those days anticipating his crucifixion. As a result, the Catholic tradition has continued to use the Metonic calendar. Well, to define the Metonic calendar, you have to bear in mind that if you were standing on a given point and you look toward the horizon, you're going to get a slight discrepancy of where the sun rises on the eastern horizon on a day-to-day basis. And as that happens, through the course of a 19.8-year cycle, the positioning will eventually return to its original location. What does that mean? Well, for the churches of the Catholic order, especially those that bear this Metonic calendar synchronization of the rising and the setting of the sun, what'll happen is whatever you might have seen, for example, insofar as the illumination of the main altar tabernacle, that exact same appearance, that exact same orientation and elevation and or what we call the azimuth of that illumination won't happen at least for another 18 years, essentially 19, and you won't see exactly what you'd seen previously until that period has elapsed. And again, it's a 19.8-year cycle, and as a result, that calendar is significant not only to the ancient Jews who basically used it during the period of the life of Christ, but also during the period of his death and crucifixion. As a result, the church continues to identify with that particular calendrical usage, as did the ancient Maya and others who maintain some of the most precise solar calendars of the ancient world. Okay, when we think about what we have, and so far as the history of what I've observed there at Mission San Jose, what I've found is that as of 2004, I did a field survey in preparation for a paper I was doing for the California Missions Foundation, and I still hadn't visited every site in order to get azimuth bearings of the church, the windows, and the orientation to the main altar. There is a calibration that involves the elevation, the azimuth, and basically the height of the windows, the length of the church. All of that factors in to how one actually calibrates these predictions, if you will. As a result, I've been able to identify some 60 sites throughout the Americas, and those sites span the whole of the Americas where the Franciscans were building churches. The work of Martha Schutz Miller, who was one of the original excavators, archaeologists at the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas, was also very much intrigued with what we call sacred geometry. And she has been able to find that a number of the churches that I have since identified with a solar geometry are also the same churches that have some of the most sophisticated architectural geometry on record. As such, what we have is both a conjunction of sophisticated solar geometry in the building of churches, as well as basically azimuth orientations of the buildings that allow for the illumination of main altar tabernacles, as well as the saints on the altars, or even further afield, specific paintings, sculptures, niches, etc., that are part of this. But given the skepticism with which I was originally met in the early days, right after 2000, 2001, when I first started presenting conference papers on this topic and also publishing, I was met with a fairly severe level of adversarial questioning. In fact, I attended a presentation that I did at Cabrillo College, and the faculty in the front row began to attempt to splinter my argument by arguing that essentially, either because I don't read Latin, that somehow I was mistaken. My response was that I read Spanish, and most of these documents that I've recovered are in fact in Spanish as opposed to Latin. That's not to say that Latin was not the code language that was used by many friars, but clearly there's much more work to be done. About the time I was doing this early research, I got into these debates about the orientations of the church at Mission San Juan Bautista. Well, at about that same time, not long afterwards, a man named Heilbronn, who's the former chancellor of UC Berkeley, basically published a book called The Sun in the Church. His entire focus was essentially with the construction of churches or the modification of churches in Italy and in France. And what he was basically arguing was that the Vatican and the Catholic Church were, unlike the characterizations that have been made, unlike the stereotypes that have been made about the church because of the Inquisition and perhaps the persecution of people who spoke to things that seemed antithetical to church belief, actually were very much at the forefront of doing mathematical, geometric, trigonometric, and other types of research in order to get at the calibration of the liturgical calendar. This calibration was significant because while they weren't concerned with the day-to-day calibration, and ultimately the church did lead the way from moving from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, the reality was they wanted exactitude. They wanted exactitude when it came to the calibration of the liturgical calendar because they wanted to get as close to the day upon which Christ was martyred as was humanly possible. And as a result, the use of the Metonic calendar became instrumental. They were able to track back to that period and then calibrate the whole of the calendar. In the books related to the ecclesiastical liturgical calendar, like the one that we can find, in fact, there are several, they're at the Mission Santa Barbara archives. What we have is a document that basically was the result of many years of research in which the church basically calibrated backwards and forward into identifying when the sun would rise on a given point and then reappear on the exact same point 19.8 years later as per the Metonic or lunar calendar. So these records are incredible. They take you back thousands of years into the past and thousands of years into the future. And this was being done in the 18th century. So what they were doing was calibrating the dates of the sunrise, the sunset, the midwinter solstice, and the midsummer solstice, as well as the equinox patterns. So what does this all mean for Mission San Jose? Well, insofar as Mission San Jose, what we have is a rather unique coincidence of factors. In 2005, within a year of my presentation before the California Missions Foundation, where I also was met with a great deal of resistance to this idea, I had one individual approach me, a prominent archaeologist in the Southwest, and he basically said in certain graphic terms, "You don't really believe this BS, do you?" And I said, my response was, it's not a question of belief, it's a question of the science. And he said, great answer. We have the exact same thing in New Mexico, in the Quaray mission. So once he said that, and once I was able to begin to get a sense of the resistance as well as the science, I chose the science to pursue the astronomy, the geometry, the liturgy, and the mathematics involved in this divine liturgy. I call it the liturgy of light. And so today, as you watch the movement of the sun at Mission San Jose, bear in mind that our first observations of this illumination took place in 2005. At that time, unfortunately, again, the skepticism basically precluded my ability to get into the church as per permission. And as a result, I found myself peering through the keyhole in the main door in order to look into the church at about the time I had calibrated would be the time at which the illumination occurred, which was roughly approximately 6:20 to 6:30 p.m. And this was on October 3rd. Bear in mind that I am a professor. I am a full-time professor and now an administrator. So the amount of time I have to devote to being able to go from one end of the country to the other, tracking these illuminations, is a bit limited. With no funding, with so much time on my hands, I've literally traveled all over the Southwest tracking these illuminations. And sometimes I've been prohibited from entering the churches, only to bring it to the attention of the pastors or the friars, and then have them come back literally raving about what they'd seen within that year. For example, in the missions at Goliad, that particular mission has an illumination that happens on Easter Sunday, and it illuminates the sole crucifix on the main altar wall. And of course, that's led to a lot of excitement there. At Mission Concepcion in Texas, we have multiple illuminations that involve both the midwinter solstice, the midsummer solstice, as well as equinoctial and other related types of illuminations that are construed as sacred. The Alpha and the Omega appear on the floor in the guise of a figure 8 within one church when tracked through the course of the year. That's not unusual, except that it does so in concert with the center of the cupula and a pendulum dropped at that location. When we go into the church at Mission San Jose, do bear in mind that the entirety of the church was reconstructed in the period of roughly 1985. The church was reopened and then reconsecrated, but it was rebuilt from the ground up over a 10-year period and was embellished, the altar replaced, the site decorated by Sir Richard Joseph Mann, His Eminence, who's been since knighted. This is an individual who took great care to make sure that the research and the documentation was in order. In fact, I have a forthcoming article about his contributions there at your mission. Anyway, okay, so insofar as what you're going to see, as the light pierces the main window from the facade, I call that the oculus. It is the giver of light. In Mexico, they call it the tragaluz, the eater of light. So the eater of light takes in the light, and as it does, at approximately between roughly 6:15 to 6:30, you'll see the light enter the chamber, and it may vary because I haven't recalibrated the specific point in the 19.8-year cycle that we're dealing with. But what you'll see is basically the light enter the chamber on the left side of the nave. It'll strike the floor, and it processes very slowly, bench by bench, step by step, all the way to the main altar. And as it arrives at the base of the railing at the foot of the main altar platform, you will see that the light begins to process upwards at a 45-degree angle, and it moves more rapidly at about that point. It is now more focused, and the sun is setting, which makes this unusual, in that there's only this church and that at San Fernando that are actually oriented such to the west that you have a sunset or a twilight illumination of the altar. And so as the sun begins to process up the altar platform, it begins to move right towards the golden or gilded tabernacle, as it would have done in the period of the missions, when Native Americans would not have had the luxury of being seated on benches. Rather, they would have been seated on the floor, on mats, on blankets, and they would have basically partaken of the liturgy at that time in that way, without benches. So they're sitting there, cross-legged, looking at the altar and watching the sun begin to process upwards in a 45-degree angle. And as it did, it would eventually intersect the tabernacle, and in so doing, the tabernacle is illuminated. And as Dolores Ferenz said, the administrator there at San Jose, when she first witnessed this, after so many years of having worked there, she was amazed. She turned to me and said, "Rubén, I can't look into the light. It's too brilliant." And that was in large part because of the incredible craftsmanship and the gilding of the main altar tabernacle made possible by Sir Richard Joseph Mann. As the light strikes the tabernacle, there is a moment. It's almost like a moment in which you see something amazing happening. You have the intersection of the liturgy, the body of Christ, and the sun all come together as part of the Christo Helios, or the solar Christ that had been part of the Roman liturgy, if you will, in which they worshipped a pagan sun who is reborn at the midwinter solstice and is reborn as victorious, or basically the victorious sun. And eventually, after that point, the sun rises to a 45-degree angle, continues to process up the face of the main altar screen, and eventually dissipates into the main altar screen itself.